You've talked about you're not going to do a coalition with the SNP.
No, that's because the Conservatives were spreading a ridiculous falsehood. But look, honestly,
well, they're going to. You've addressed one hypothetical.
We've got 2.5 weeks to go till the general election. I take an old-fashioned view. We put the issues before people. We don't get into all of the process business. We put the issues before people about what kind of country we want to build, and then the voters choose and the voters decide. And I think that is actually the right way to do it. And I actually think the British people deserve better than a inside the beltway discussion about permutations and hypotheticals and all that. Let's talk about the issues. There are huge issues about the future of young people, whether we reward work again in this country, our health service.
A lot of people think, a lot of people perhaps in England, some perhaps in Wales, think the SNP calling the shots on what a Labour government that may not have the support of England.
That ain't going to happen. That ain't going to happen.
But how can you say it's not going to happen if you rely on their votes to get English measures passed, if you don't have a majority of English and Welsh MPs? How can you say it's not going to happen?
It will be. You know, the House of Commons works in a very simple way. It's for people in the House of Commons to decide how they vote on measures put before the House of Commons, and that will be the case after the election. That's one forecast I can confidently. I can confidently.
So you're not worried about the situation in which you might end up relying on SNP support, even without a deal, in which they will tell you what measures in England are going to apply?
They're not going to tell us. They're not going to tell us. Look, I'm very clear about that.
As a matter of constitutional principle, after the election, do you think it is important that the biggest party in the Commons, the biggest party, the one with the most seats, should be given the kind of time and space to form a government? It has the moral legitimacy.
I'm really sorry to be disappointing about this, but I'm afraid I'm not going to get into post-election speculation. Look, there are massive issues facing the country.
But these are constitutional, hugely important.
Yeah, and no doubt we'll discuss them if any matter arises after the election. We'll discuss it. But honestly, there are huge issues facing people watching tonight.
But Miliband, don't you think it's actually rather important for the public when they come to vote to be thinking about permutations and possible outcomes that are going to result? These are not just sort of vague, weird hypotheticals that I'm talking about. These are things that are indicated by all the polls at the moment and all the forecasts.
You know what I think? When I go around the country, people are asking about the permutations in their own lives. They're asking whether they're going to be able to pay the bills at the end of the month. They're going to ask whether somebody's going to stand up to the energy companies and the tax avoiders and the banks. They're asking whether I recognise what they feel, which is Britain doesn't work for them. It may work for the richest, but it doesn't work for them. That's the big argument at this election. It's the big argument facing us. It's our generational question, the question of inequality, who the country works for. That is the big question. And countries all around the world are facing it, and we've got to address that in the remaining 2.5 weeks.
I think you find it difficult to talk about these outcomes, and you want to wait until you see what the outcome is before you make your mind up as to what you want to say.
I take an old-fashioned view, which is that you let the people decide.
Right. Can we quickly talk about the NHS? You've criticised the current government for reorganising the NHS in England. The government has spent billions on a top-down reorganisation that the NHS is still reeling from, you said. Can you assure us there will be no top-down reorganisation of the NHS on your watch?
Yes.
Now, because your manifesto says we'll repeal the Health and Social Care Act, scrap the competition regime, restore proper democratic accountability, and establish a sensible commissioning framework. That sounds a bit like a top-down reorganisation.
No,
why is that not a top-down?
Shall I go through? Let me go through the issues, but they are important.
Well, very, very briefly. But
well,
I'm just trying to get at whether it's a reorganisation or whether.
And it's not a top-down.
So explain why it isn't a top-down.
Okay, I'll definitely reorganise. There are two important things here. The first important thing is the most important reason to repeal the Health and Social Care Act is that it's based on the idea that every service in the NHS should be subject to being contracted out, competitive tendering, privatisation. I think that's dangerous for the NHS. But I think the task for the NHS is an integrated service. It's about health care, it's about physical health, mental health, social care, working better together. Now, on the question of how we're going to have this more integrated service without a top-down reorganisation. It's a very good report, which I'd recommend you and others read, by someone called John Oldham, that we commissioned on this. And what it says is, you set a direction of travel at the centre, but it's for people locally to actually work together, collaborate together. But we are absolutely not talking about reshuffling the deck chairs and all of that, because I don't think that would be a good. I don't think that would be a good thing. It's not what the health service wants. It's so damaging. David Cameron's reforms diverted billions of pounds from the NHS, people waiting longer in A&E, longer for their operations, longer for their test results. I'm really worried about the future of the NHS under David Cameron. We're not going to have a top-down reorganisation.
Okay. I want to just go look at some ideas and beliefs you have. And I want to start this by playing a little clip to you. This is a clip of Margaret Thatcher. Actually, it's the day she was dethroned from her leadership of the Conservative Party. She was facing questions in the House of Commons, and she tried to set out the difference between her and socialists in their view of inequality. Let's have a look at the clip over there.
They'd rather have the poor poorer. Once they start to talk about the gap, they'd rather the gap was that. Down here. That. Not that. But that. So long as the gap is smaller, so long as the gap is smaller, they'd rather have the poor poorer.
I think she was wrong. I think she was wrong.
The point she was making is that socialists, she used the phrase that the socialists don't care how poor we are as long as the gap is smaller. Can you nail on the head? You would rather we were all richer, even if the gap wasn't even if the gap was wider.
I think that misreads the evidence and the way the country succeeds. And let me explain why. Look, the old view, and this is what Lady Thatcher was saying there, is that inequality, so a more unequal society, could somehow be better for everybody. Better for the richest, because they were obviously richer, and better for the poorest, because they were richer too. It doesn't work like that. I mean, it hasn't worked. In fact, there's a huge amount of evidence now from around the world that more unequal societies are less successful societies. Why? Because if you don't train your young people, then you're losing out as a country and you are less prosperous. If you try and believe that people can subsist on extremely low wages, that isn't good for people. That isn't good for the people at the bottom of our society on the lowest wages. But it doesn't make for a productive country either. You know, productivity in this country is actually its lowest level for 25 years. So if the Thatcher idea of a race to the bottom, as I call it, low wages, insecure work, was the way to succeed as a country, well, we might be succeeding now, but I don't believe we are. So I think she's sort of wrong in belief, wrong in evidence, wrong in outcome.
But you know, there were years over the last Labour government, weren't there, when we were getting less equal, but we were becoming more rich. Are you saying that was all a disaster because we did become richer and we became less equal?
I'm not saying that from time to time that may be
so would
that
that
may
be a
true.
failure? If you were in charge for 5 years, and at the end of those 5 years, everybody was 30% richer, you had stupendous economic performance, but that the gap had widened. To suppose that had happened,
it's not.
Would you say it's not likely to? You say, but if
it's not going to happen. No,
would that be
look,
failure?
no. Look, but the evidence is just different from what you say. The evidence is. We've got to go by the evidence here.
But it does sometimes happen. You've already said it sometimes.
But let me go to the central, I think, test of my economic policy. The central test of my economic policy is: does the growth in our economy, is it reflected in what's happening to the living standards of working people? You see, I call it the cost of living crisis. That's what people call it. And what is that about? That's about that the growth in the economy has become detached from the living standards of ordinary families. So those at the top are getting a large share of the pie. It's happening in the United States, it's happening here. And other people, it's not just the poorest, by the way. That's a new inequality. It's not just the richest versus the poorest. It's the richest versus everyone else. That isn't success in my view. It doesn't make for a successful country.
And it wouldn't be a success. I just want to nail this. It really wouldn't be a success on your view if you ruled the country for 5 years and at the end of it, we were all a tiny bit poorer, but the gap was much narrower.
We were all a tiny bit poorer.
Well, yes, so the poor are a little bit poorer, tiny bit poorer.
No, I don't want us to be poorer. Definitely not. I can tell you that would be unsuccessful.
That would be unsuccessful.
Yes, definitely.
So the gap matters.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't trade off living standard for gap, so to speak. You would rather have...
Well, I don't really agree with the trade-off, as I've tried to explain, because I actually think that inequality, as I say, is damaging for prosperity. And that's what all the evidence... Look, you've got the International Monetary Fund, right, not known for being a kind of left-wing kind of rabble, not known for being a kind of far-left organisation. Even they're producing papers now saying that the gap is a problem.
The gap is a problem.
Yeah,
no,
exactly.
Yeah,
but no, it's not just a problem. It's not just a problem, but it makes us less prosperous. So the Thatcher view's wrong.
Let's just talk a little about welfare and the people at the bottom. Do you believe there are any people, the poor, who you would call undeserving poor?
I don't like the phrase, but there are definitely people who are, and it's a minority, who could work but aren't doing so, and we need to get them back to work, and we've got to be tough. Because I think responsibility is important. I think responsibility is a foundation for a successful welfare system. I think you need responsibility and you need compassion. And both of them are incredibly important parts of a welfare system. I don't think this government's got either of them right, frankly.
Do you think parents who would like another child but know they can't afford to look after their child, they're going to rely on extra benefits, or they're going to need social housing or more housing benefit, do you think those parents should say, we can't afford to look after our child, we shouldn't have this kid, or wait until we've got better income? Or do you think it's reasonable to say, look, the state should help us out here and we can have that child?
Well, you know, I think that the judgment that parents make about whether they have more children is an incredibly personal judgment. And I don't really think it's for politicians to tell parents whether they should have another child.
You're reluctant to get drawn into sort of nannying or be seen to be.
Well, I don't think. I think it's a very odd person who aspires to be prime minister who starts telling parents, "I want you to have X number of children." I think they do it in some countries, but it's not going to be part of a Miliband government. No. I can promise you.
But you can see people who think, I'm going to wait till I can afford for a child, may think, I don't want to be paying taxes for other people who just have a kid and expect the state to pick up the bill.
Let's talk about the way the system works. The system works in this way, which is that we have child benefit and child tax credits, which are a recognition of the importance of us supporting families in this country. I think that's important to recognise it. Why is that important? It's important for all of us, because with an ageing population, actually you need people in the workforce working to support us, me, you, in our old age. That's important. But responsibility is an important principle in welfare. You know, that's why we've got policies that say, if you're a young person who's been out of work more than a year, we're going to offer you a job, compulsory jobs guarantee, but if you don't take the job, you'll lose benefits. Similarly for the long-term unemployed. So responsibility matters. Ed Miliband telling people how many children to have, an ex-child policy is not in my manifesto.
Right. Look, we're coming to a close. I want to just finish actually on the Margaret Thatcher theme, because looking at where the country is now, you have said it's rather like perhaps where it was in 1979, at one of these pivotal turning points. I think you said it's a similar moment in the sense of the old order crumbling without it being 100% clear as to what's going to replace it. She was a conviction politician. I think you're a conviction politician. She was underestimated when she was in opposition. People, I think you say the same about you. How relevant do you think the parallels between you and Margaret Thatcher are? Taking it as read, you're not of the same beliefs as her. How much parallel should we draw?
Well, I think comparisons like that are invidious, and I don't really want to be compared to a Conservative Prime Minister. The way I'd put it slightly differently, which is I'd compare myself to previous Labour Prime Ministers. Clement Attlee, Harold Wilson, Tony Blair, they all came in and said we need to change the old way of running things. It was true in 1945, never again, back to what we'd seen in the 30s, but we built an NHS, or that government built the NHS. Harold Wilson, the white heat of technology. Tony Blair, crumbling public realm, rebuild public services. I believe that we do need to call time on the old way of running things. And in a way, the Thatcher clip is quite relevant to this. There's an old idea that if you look after the richest in our society, the wealth magically trickles down to everybody else. The problem is it doesn't work. And we've had that experiment over the last 5 years and we've failed. And therefore, that's why when I say it's only when working people succeed that the country succeeds, that isn't just a political slogan. That is a reality about who you put first in your country and how a country succeeds. You know, are we going to have a Prime Minister? The kind of Prime Minister I want to be, I'll be thinking every day, how do we reward the hard work of everyone in our country? How do we give every young person an opportunity? How do we have a rescue plan for our NHS? And we are going to have a rescue plan for our NHS. And we're very, very clear about that.
Ed Miliband, thank you very much.
Thank
indeed.
you.
The Leader debates continue on Wednesday night at 7:30 as Evan Davis interviews UKIP leader Nigel Farage.